Father Hovorun is a priest of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. He's a past chair of that church's department of external church relations, so he's been very active in ecumenical dialogue, both among the churches of Ukraine and with Lutheran, Anglican, Roman Catholic, Oriental churches elsewhere. He's also a teacher and a researcher in the fields of patristics, church history, ecclesiology, political theology, and sociology of religion. He holds a candidate degree from the Kyiv Theological Academy and a PhD in theology from the University of Durham. His work there was published by Brill in 2008 as Will, Action, and Freedom, Christological Controversies in the 7th Century. So he's taught widely in Ukraine and abroad. He's been very active in the development of theological education in the Orthodox Church, and he's now the coordinator of programs in theology at the Kyiv National University. He's currently a research fellow at Yale University, where he's working on a project about the churches in the public square, focusing on the patterns of behavior of the Eastern churches. And as the Maidan situation developed this year, Father Hovorun was one of the important voices commenting on this and drawing our attention to the important religious dimension of the Maidan experience. So I ask you to join me in welcoming Father Hovorun.
Thank you, Heather, for the words of the introduction, and thank you for invitation to the University of Alberta. Thank you, and thank you also, David, for making my coming here possible. It is really a great privilege to be here. We were joking just recently that Alberta is probably the best part of Ukraine, the best province of Ukraine, and I really feel at home here. Why it is the best province of Ukraine is because of its really outstanding academic institutions like this university. I wish we had in Ukraine the same kind of quality in education and research. I hope it will happen one day with the assistance of of our community, Ukrainian community here, with the assistance of the universities and the center, and we work together in this, in making this possible. And an important part of making things possible in Ukraine is to exchange views, to exchange thoughts, and I envisage that today's discussion will be not just a lecture, but a real true exchange of views and opinions. I'm sure that everyone now in the world knows and has an opinion about what is going in Ukraine, because Ukraine has been so much in the world media, in the news, and it has become really a center of the attention from the entire world. I recall a conversation that I had just, I think, a year ago in Ukraine with some colleagues of mine, and I was saying that, no one in the West is really interested in what is going on in Ukraine or in Russia. Well, people in Russia tend to believe that they are somehow in the center of the world's interest, but well, it was not anymore the case. That was my opinion, and even more Ukraine was not really part of an attractive point for media. And all of a sudden, everything changed, and all of a sudden, Ukraine became really an important part of the world agenda. And I believe what is going on in Ukraine is a kind of, maybe it's too, apocalyptic, even maybe it's too pretentious, but I think Ukraine has become a kind of point of judgment for many things in the world. Maidan in Kyiv has become an event, almost eschatological, apocalyptic event of judgment of Ukraine itself. it has become a point of judgment for the Russian society, because the society has been divided into two parts. The one part, that the largest part, unfortunately, which endorsed and supported the aggression against Ukraine, and the smaller but maybe most precious part of the society which did not support it. Ukraine has become a kind of judgment event. The Maidan became a judgment event for Europe, because Europe now cannot go back to its usual business. Europe has to rethink profoundly what it is. What does it mean to be Europe? Because probably for the first time in the whole European history, in the history of the European Union, people under the flags of the European Union died for European values. It never happened in the European Union per se, and we saw it happening in Ukraine. And Ukraine is largely about judging what Europe is. And I think the events on the Maidan will urge the European thinkers to think again about what is Europe. There was a joke, well, half joke, half tragic kind of sentence that under Yanukovych, when the European Union tried to force Yanukovych to sign the agreement, the European politicians insisted on the European values, and Yanukovych instead asked for money. On the Maidan, the Ukrainians asked for values, and Europeans started talking about money. So it was a kind of unexpected twist, which indicates some kind of crisis, I think, in the European identity, if you wish. And I think Ukraine has somehow revealed this kind of weak point in the European identity. I think generally the Western civilization has been urged somehow to rethink about what is liberal democracy, what democracy is at all, under the influence of the Ukrainian event. So I believe Ukraine is really an important part of the world agenda, and it has become really, it has created a momentum for many countries to rethink what they're accustomed to do as their values, as their principles, and so forth. And primarily, of course, it is doomsday for Ukraine itself. It has indicated, it has demonstrated the weak points of Ukraine. It has demonstrated the strong points of the Ukrainian people. It has also, Ukraine somehow has become, I would say, a laboratory of the political processes that happened in the world history and in the European history a long time ago. In this laboratory of Ukraine, we can see how the values of the liberal society were born in Europe a long time ago. Probably those processes have become so much idealized that they've become forgotten somehow. People keep them on the margin of their conscience and don't really realize how the democratic values evolved in Europe. And now in Ukraine you can see how hard it can be. The Ukrainian situation has demonstrated how, and particularly the aggression against Ukraine, has demonstrated how totalitarian regimes in Europe were born and developed. We think we have an illusion that the totalitarian processes, or even if you wish, the birth of fascism in Europe. It is a piece of the past. It is not. And I think what is going on in Ukraine, one can see how the totalitarian ideology, particularly coming from the north, how propaganda in its worst incarnations can be brought again and can work and can influence minds throughout the world. So I think Ukraine is interesting from many perspectives, from the perspective of media, from the perspective of political science, and it is extremely interesting from the perspective of religion. And Ukraine is also a laboratory, a lab, to see how the church and the civil society can interact. Something that we can rarely can see probably in the European context. And this distinctive feature of Ukraine is that the civil society in Ukraine is being born not separately from the church, but with the assistance being facilitated by the church. And unlike many European countries, well, I don't take now the US in the American context, or US context, but in European countries, the civil society was often born through wrestling with the church, by denying the church, by stressing the secular character as a secular phenomenon, civil society as a secular phenomenon. Well, in the US it is different because the US is different, has a different context, and the democratic values in the US stem somehow from the Protestant ethics and religious beliefs of the American people. In Ukraine, we see how the civil society, which is being born on the Maidan, is getting stronger with the assistance, with the contribution of the church. That's why I think Maidan was an important both civil and religious phenomenon. It was indeed a religious phenomenon. And I would like to explore in my paper this side of the Maidan, which was, well, people realize from the pictures, actually all of you probably have seen those pictures of the priests on the Maidan, of people praying on the Maidan. So I wouldn't say, I wouldn't show you in my presentation anything that you haven't seen on the media. So this aspect of the Maidan has been, of course, reflected in the media, but I think what we need now is to reflect theologically or socially or theoretically on this religious aspect of the Maidan. And the Maidan will, any narrative about Maidan will be deficient without this religious aspect. Whether we accept religion or we deny it, it was just religion, the church, was just an important part of the events of the Maidan, and the theological narrative has been, is, and will be hopefully an important part of the general narrative of the Maidan. I would like to start the exploration of this aspect of the Maidan with a story. This story has been told by a famous, now famous Ukrainian blogger, Olesia Mamchich. She is just a mother of two kids of 8 and 3 years old, and she told the story on her Facebook page, and it was about her husband, Sashko, who, together with many other faithful, peaceful people like him, what they went through during the Maidan's events. And it's just an episode but it is indicative of what was going on, of what Maidan was all about. So the story tells a full bus of the Berkut. Well, of course, everyone knows what is Berkut. It was a special force that took an active part in suppressing the protest. Attacked our blue Lanos, driven by Sashko. He was pulled out of the car, put on the ground, and beaten. Later on, together with others, he was brought somewhere nearby, I suspect the Mariinsky Park. There, though snow was falling, the earth was in the blood. They released 2 girls on their way, while they took the boys outward. Sashko had a wonderful grandfather's army coat, our family heirloom. We did not see that coat anymore, but it doesn't matter. They laid the boys in their sweaters on the -20 degrees cold on the ground, and some put on their knees. They held them thus for up to 2 hours. Something human awakened in their souls, because on the halfway they threw on Sashko's shoulders someone else's jacket. While Sashko was on his knees in the snow, the Berkut men conducted a lesson of political information, telling their point of view on the Maidan. In particular, they were extremely interested in how much we were paid. Well, at least 200 hryvnias is for sure. They were not convinced by the answers. So 200 hryvnias is approximately $20 US. So they believe that the Maidan people were paid their participation. That is mine. And the final touch. He required from Sashko to say, "Glory be to the Berkut." My husband said, "Glory be to everyone who has not lost his conscience." I think this story reveals the core of the civil strife incarnate in the Maidan. People on the one side of the Kievan barricades firmly believed that social activity could be only a simulation stimulated with money, fear, or power. These values, widely admired in the post-Soviet countries, were demonstrated by the soldiers of the Berkut and thousands who participated in the so-called anti-Maidans in support of Yanukovych and his regime. Actually, this story also, I want to make a remark, presents an image of the Maidan adopted by those who were against the Maidan. So this image was that people got paid for their participation. There was a very heavy involvement of the CIA and Western mysterious Western powers who ignited the protest and so forth. And interestingly, if you observe what is going on now in the eastern part of Ukraine, which is also a kind of protest, which is also a kind of Maidan, those protests mirror not the Maidan, but the picture of the Maidan presented particularly in the Russian media, presented in the the picture that had this Berkut people who interrogated the Maidan people. So it is a completely distorted picture of the Maidan. Okay, but the reality which is developing in the eastern Ukraine is a reality which mirrors this distorted picture of the Maidan. So it's not a kind of mimicking the Maidan, what is going on in the eastern part of Ukraine, but it is mimicking the picture of the Maidan developed through the Russian propaganda. So it is important to understand what kind of picture of the Maidan people had. Those people had who were against the Maidan, actually. And what kind of mentality they have developed that made them thinking of the Maidan exactly like this. So the people of who those people who were against the Maidan, they were, they were somehow driven by certain values. Well, they believed that the Maidan protesters got paid, either they were afraid of something, or they considered Maidan in terms of money, fear, and power. They wanted political power for themselves. They wanted money and so forth. Essentially, this is the set of values which was shared also by Yanukovych and his regime. There is a joke what people like Yanukovych believed in. They believed in three things. First thing is money. Second thing is money. Well, you can guess what is the third thing. So this was a kind of one set of one system of coordinates in which they moved. And these were the principles: money, fear, and power, on which the regime of Yanukovych relied a lot, and which actually caused this wide protest on the Maidan. In fact, the majority of the people who stood on the other side of the barricades, the Maidan people, they were actually resolved to die in hope that there are things that matter more than money, comfort, health, and the very life. They summarized all these values in the words conscience and dignity. In essence, the Maidan was all about dignity. It was therefore correctly branded as the Maidan of dignity. In the system of the political and social coordinates which dominated in Ukraine in the last years, such words as dignity, justice, and democracy were just words. The reality behind these words was opposite to their original meaning. Dignity, justice, and democracy in this system of coordinates were imitational, not real. Actually, imitation is a word, I think, which describes pretty well what was going on in Ukraine. I would even suggest to consider, to measure, if you wish, the level of health of the society in terms of imitation. If we can apply a kind of coefficient of imitation, we can measure the society. Say, there were courts, but they imitated justice. There was a president, but he just imitated presidency, and essentially he effectively converted his political power into wealth. There was a kind of society, but it functioned not as a society, but as a horde of people driven by common kind of economic interests. We pay now for the imitational character of the Ukrainian society because it appears now that army, political authority, all of that was imitational. And now we see how imitational it was. The army is dysfunctioning, actually. The institutions that were supposed to preserve the integrity of the country all of a sudden appear to be dysfunctional. And the problems that the Ukrainian government faces now in the eastern parts of Ukraine stem from the past, where imitation was the main feature of the political, social, economic, and so forth development of the country. Well, I'm afraid to say that other institutions of Ukraine were also somehow imitational, like church, because the church was supposed to raise its prophetic voice, to say what is wrong and what is correct in the society, and the church didn't. The church preferred to keep silence over the massive abuses of people's dignity, rights, and the very life of. So the Maidan became a kind of point of return from imitation, from the imitational model of the social development to the real one. Probably Maidan was the only real thing in Ukraine during last years. It was definitely more real than the state. It was definitely more real than the opposition. I think I would dare to say that Maidan was maybe in some sense more real than the church leadership. And the church had to grow up in order to meet the new criteria, the new principles that the Maidan established. So let us come back to our narrative. So in Ukraine, the model, the socio-political model which was established in Ukraine was deeply imitational. It had what I call a semantic shift. The words from the political lingua franca, from the political vocabulary of the Western world, like democracy, like parliament, like representation, and so forth, function like homonyms when applied to the post-Soviet socio-political realities. So, but in reality, these realities, in effect, these realities can be better described by antonyms. So what they call democracy functioned in Ukraine as just opposite to what democracy is meant in the West. What they call parliament functioned in a completely different, opposite way to what parliament is supposed to, and so forth. So by name, these are synonyms, but by essence, these words, these phenomena are antonyms to each other. Also, what was called justice, was a complete corruption of the judicial system. Anti-fascism suspiciously resembles fascism, etc. And this system was not uniquely Ukraine. What Ukraine has demonstrated is a kind of reductio ad absurdum of the system which became developing in the post-Soviet milieu somehow. Yanukovych just intensified, amplified the processes that became developing in the post-Soviet countries. This model is not post-Soviet anymore. It is a neo-Soviet, and it is not just a transition model as it was accustomed to believe in the West. In the West, the picture of the Soviet, post-Soviet territory was a kind of gray picture of a transition, countries in transition from the Soviet past to the democratic future. And the maximum idea that the Western, many in the Western political circles had was that, well, somehow the processes go slowly, or sometimes they just intensify, but well, the vector of the development is like this, that they come from the Soviet past and they go to the democratic future. sooner or later. But the reality, and I think, well, people in the West have realized now this, that the reality was completely different, because what has been established in Russia and in other post-Soviet countries was a self-sufficient political system, quite firm, quite consistent within itself, quite stable, I would say. It features some elements of the Soviet past, but it should not be identified as a half Soviet. No, it's a new constituency. It's a new political, socio-political phenomenon, which has absorbed some features of the past, but should not be identified with it. In some sense, it is much worse than the Soviet model, this neo-Soviet model, because as we see, it features an even more shameless propaganda. It features more abuses. Unlike the Soviet state, it is not it doesn't even pretend to be a welfare state. It does not pretend to care about people. There's a huge gap between rich people and poor people. In Moscow, for instance, if you go from Moscow just 100 kilometers outside the city, you will find just medieval, kind of ruins instead of villages, and population actually dying out. And this is a striking contrast between the social strata. They didn't have this kind of contrast, social contrast in the Soviet era. This post-Soviet socio-political or neo-Soviet political system is largely, although it is self-sufficient and it features continuity with itself, so it's kind of solid block. I think it is largely postmodern in many senses. I think the best description of this system was given by the famous modern Russian writer, novelist Viktor Pelevin. Maybe you've heard of him. He has written a number of novels like Generation P. The English title of this novel is Homo Sapiens and Babylon, and Snuff, another novel. I think, well, it actually, interestingly enough, dedicates one novel to one term of Putin, somehow. And he decodes somehow the socio-political system, I think in the best possible, in the best way, better than others do, of the stages of the development of this system. It indicates, and Pelevin stresses very well, I think, the postmodern character of the post-Soviet, modern post-Soviet socio-political system. As a matter of fact, well, postmodernism is a kind of, as a thing which was supposed to oppose ideologies. In this regard, the Russian regime, which was described by Pelevin, was postmodernist in a sense that it didn't feature any meaningful ideology. It was ideology-less in many regards. Though many people felt that in Russia, say that, and in Ukraine, that, well, we need some kind of ideology, like some kind of communist-like ideology. But the regime was not about ideology, it was about money, actually, about making money. And now the situation has somehow changed because the socio-political system, which at its current stage has been endowed with an ideology, and plutocracy turned to a civilizational project. The newly born neo-Soviet ideology expresses itself in religious terms and resembles a civil religion. This neo-Soviet civil religion features otherwise incompatible elements of the old Russian imperial ideology, communism in its heart, Stalinist tradition, Orthodox Christianity, etc. It is called to legitimize the neo-Soviet political model and the ruling elites that subscribe to it. The entire post-Soviet space is being proselytized with this religion, and this neo-Soviet political religion is at the core of the conservative international, which Moscow tries to sell to the West. The neo-Soviet model, which is being legitimized by the corresponding civil religion, is extremely profitable for those who have access to political power. It is designed particularly to convert political authority to wealth. Therefore, when in 2009 Yanukovych won the presidential office, he became one of the zealous adepts of this model, adherents of this model and its religion. As a result, he and his family turned fabulously wealthy. As for the rest of the people, they became significantly poorer, completely dependent on those with political power and deprived of the rudiments of the social justice that they had before. However, people came to the Maidan to protest not so much personally against the president and his family, but against the system which Yanukovych supported and perfected. Maidan thus accumulated protests against the political model which became dominant in the former Soviet republics. It was essentially anti-Soviet, or better to say anti-neo-Soviet. Symbolical in this regard is that the protesters took care to pull down as many monuments of Lenin as they could. At the core of the social, and on the contrary, those who were against Maidan, they said, I remember some interesting reports about people in Russia complaining about Maidan, that it pulled down so many statues of Lenin. They said, well, those people are really bad because they pulled down Lenin everywhere. So it was really, well, Lenin became a kind of symbolic figure. On the one hand, people who wanted him to be down. On the other hand, people who wanted him to be on the monuments. And this is symbolical because it exactly expresses this Soviet anti-Soviet strife in Ukraine. Maidan is a manifestation of this strife. So at the core of the social conflict that the Maidan embodied was not so much a tension between pro-Western and pro-Russian orientation of the country, but a tension between those who are against and those who are for the neo-Soviet model of development of the Ukrainian nation. This was, in effect, a conflict between two perceptions of citizenship. The one, which inclines to the Soviet style of paternalism, and the other, that values personal responsibility and dignity of the human person. This explains the unexpectedly violent reaction of Russia to the victory of Maidan. Because the Maidan seriously challenged the socio-political system which Putin has constructed in Russia and meticulously cultivated in other former Soviet countries. So the spread of this neo-Soviet model was supposed to secure the influence of Russia over other post-Soviet countries. And exactly because Maidan opposed this model, it became extremely dangerous to Moscow. Because it suggested, it offered a different socio-political model. For many Russians now understand that Ukraine and the Maidan was not just about revival of the Ukrainian nation. It was about offering an alternative Russia, about presenting an image what Russia could have been if Maidan could spread its influence further to Russia. So Ukraine has become a kind of other Russia, the other Russia, and Maidan that's why has become so much dangerous to the Russia which is there at the moment. It means, in turn, that the changes in Ukraine have created a very powerful momentum for the changes in Russia. And I think, despite all the aggression of Putin against Ukraine, this unbelievable aggression, Ukraine still has this strong momentum to change not only itself, but to spread its change to other countries. And I don't mean only Russia, but also other countries that suffer from the same socio-political model, neo-Soviet socio-political model. The calculation of Putin in his aggression against Ukraine is based on the support of those in the country who are nostalgic about the Soviet Union and subscribe to the values of the neo-Soviet social model. Among these values are paternalism, the cult of a powerful leader, and patriotism with the elements of Nazism. In 1979, a famous Soviet and Russian writer Vasily Aksionov published his novel The Island of Crimea, Ostrov Krim. You've probably heard of this novel. In this utopia, he imagined what would have happened to Crimea if the Bolsheviks did not take it. The utopian Crimea of Aksionov was a flourishing, democratic, Western-style republic, free of any element of Sovietism, which Aksionov hated, actually. So it was an alternative Russia. Well, the historical irony is that the real Crimea seems to be the completely opposite to the Crimea of Aksionov. The Crimea of Putin is a sanctuary of the Soviet Union, and it will be now. It has been conserved there. So Crimea, the real Crimea, nowadays is Aksionov's Russia, and Ukraine is Aksionov's Crimea, quite ironically. Speaking about the moral strength of the Maidan, one cannot avoid addressing the issue of violence there, particularly by the activists from the far-right groups. And Ukrainian far-right is an important issue, of course, related to the Maidan. But it should be regarded with care. Originally, the Ukrainian protests were non-violent. The Maidan was, I called them the Maidan a collective Gandhi that abstained from any violence. The protesters not only refrained from violence themselves, but also tried to prevent any provocation towards violence initiated by the gangs employed by the regime. Say, if we imagine that the Maidan came gathered after the students were beaten on the 30th of November. The next days, the 1st and the 2nd of December, Maidan came, and there was a very good chance that Maidan, with hundreds of thousands of people who came together, could have overthrown the regime of Yanukovych with application of some violence there. And Maidan didn't do that, just exactly in order to avoid violence. And in order to avoid violence, the Maidan paid with the lives of these people. That was the price. The heavenly 100 was the price that the Maidan paid in order to avoid violence at the stage when the violence could be avoided in the beginning. And this is a very important feature of the Maidan, which is often neglected by those who criticize Maidan for being, who tend to see Maidan as a kind of place with people from far right and so forth. But in fact, well, it has been criticized by many, even in Europe. But sometimes I just say to myself, if the far right people were so a minority on the Maidan, that if we consider this, if we apply the same criteria of judgment that some European observers applied to the Maidan, saying that it was a kind of far right movement, then the European Parliament is a far right institution. Because with the function of so many people from the far right parties in the European Parliament, we from Ukraine can say, yes, then if the Maidan was a kind of far right phenomenon, then the European Parliament is a far right phenomenon. Because the faction of those far right people on the Maidan was not more than the faction of the far right people in the European Parliament. So it's then not fair to condemn Maidan for being a kind of extremist phenomenon. In its majority, in its mentality, in its core, Maidan was a peaceful phenomenon, a kind of manifestation of peaceability of the Ukrainian people. I just want to remind that after the dictator, the Maidan changed its behavior from insistently peaceful to some kind of violent reaction to the regime after the dictatorship laws were adopted by the parliament on the January 16th this year, and the protesters were forced to defend themselves. The inability of the Ukrainian opposition leaders, of the EU and US leadership to offer a meaningful plan and to timely introduce sanctions against the most odious figures of the regime made the Maidan change its behavior. At the latest stage of the protests, the young activists from the far right and the leftist movements demonstrated excessive violence. Some of them were provocators engaged by the regime. Some of them were youngsters who looked for adventure. Some were people overwhelmed by the desire to revenge after the snipers shot down dozens of the protesters. These radical groups did not, however, express the dominating mood of the Maidan's majority. And I believe the core of the Maidan remained peaceful and faithful to the initial values. And the churches played an important role in preserving the peaceful character of the Maidan. So now we come to the role of the Ukrainian churches, which was not marginal at all, but central. It was characteristic more of the pre-modern epoch than the epoch of secularization. Essentially, there is, a big discussion about the modern times as a kind of epoch of post-secular, that the times of optimistic secularism that dominated in the 70s or 80s or even 90s, these times have gone, and instead it appears that religion comes back to the public square, and this coming back of religion to the public square has been described as post-secularism, explored particularly by people like Jürgen Habermas in Germany, like the American sociologists like Peter Berger, Jose Casanova, and Charles Taylor, and others. And I think the role of the Ukrainian churches in the Maidan, in the civil strife on the Maidan, exactly fits this post-secular paradigm when the churches came back to the public square from the isolation to the private life where they were put previously. In speaking of the Ukrainian churches, I mean the three main Orthodox churches. The largest of them is the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in communion with the Moscow Patriarchate. This is the only Ukrainian church recognized by the Fellowship of the Orthodox Churches worldwide. The second largest church is the Patriarchate of Kyiv, which was founded in 1992, and the smallest church is the Ukrainian Autocephalous Orthodox Church, which originates from the autocephalous movement that started in 1918 and which rooted itself here in Canada, and exactly that church became, I think, the second largest after the Greek Church, Orthodox Church in Canada, and then it moved back to Ukraine when after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and became known as a Ukrainian Autocephalous Church. There is also a Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, a Catholic Church sui juris, which follows the Eastern Rite. The Ukrainian churches in the beginning of the protests were not up to the expectations of the awakening civil society. The Maidan articulated and enacted a moral code that the Ukrainian churches were supposed to uphold, but failed to do this during the formation of the political regime of Yanukovych. All of them were more or less collaborating with the regime. All of them also got infected with many social diseases common in the neo-Soviet societies. During the years before the Maidan, none of the Ukrainian churches went far from the paradigm of the church-state relations, which favors relationship with the state at the expense of relationship with the society. Some of them were more aligned with the state, like the Moscow Patriarchate Church. Some were less, like the Patriarchate of Kyiv, but still all of them were dreaming of a closer relationship with the state. The Greek Catholic Church was probably more than other churches advancing in its social teaching and actions. And nevertheless, it did not bother the state with the moral lessons. So in this regard, the Greek Catholic Church followed the same paradigm of the church-state relationship common in the post-Soviet countries. The situation, however, changed with the protests at the Maidan. All of the churches had to reconsider their position in the triangle church-state society. All of them chose as a priority the relationship with the nascent civil society. They did it to different degrees, though. The most active in supporting the social awakening was the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. The Patriarchate of Kyiv was more reluctant in aligning with the protesters, but eventually firmly supported them. It offered, for instance, the protesters its St. Michael's Monastery in the center of Kyiv, which was turned to a hospital and a shelter for the protesters who sought protection from the riot police. The Ukrainian Church under the Moscow Patriarchate tried to keep neutrality. There were hierarchs and priests who openly supported the regime of Yanukovych. There were also priests of this church who made a stand in favor of the Maidan. The Ukrainian Church of the Moscow Patriarchate eventually condemned the regime simultaneously with its fall. The model of relationship, when the church prefers the state to the society, is common in the post-Soviet countries. It is rooted in the traditions of the Byzantine Symphony and was particularly enhanced by the oppressive regimes during the Soviet period. This model, however, demonstrates weakness when the society emancipates from the state. This happened many times in the modern history and put the church in front of a difficult dilemma of choosing between the state and the society. When the churches, following the traditional paradigm of symphony, chose the state and not the society, they later or earlier faced marginalization and growing anti-clericalism. This was the dilemma which the Ukrainian churches faced during the most tense weeks of the confrontation between the Maidan and the regime of Yanukovych. The hardest choice had to make the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in union with the Moscow Patriarchate, which was famous for its support of the regime. The circumstances of this church were similar to the circumstances of the Orthodox Church in Greece, in the period of the military junta. And I'd like to make this kind of comparison of the Ukrainian Church under Yanukovych and the Greek Orthodox Church under the military junta from 1967 to 1974. The motives of the regimes of Yanukovych and of the Greek colonels were different, but the methods of establishing dictatorship were similar. Both usurped power, changed the constitution, subdued courts, relied on the law enforcement agencies to suppress dissidents, and established authoritarianism. A particularly striking similarity is that the junta in Greece ended after the student insurgents in the Polytechnic University of Athens, so-called Politechnio, in November 1973. The Maidan came to its active phase after the students of Kyiv were beaten on the night of the 30th of November 2013, exactly 40 years later. It is a very interesting, striking coincidence. Well, month to month, 40 years later, the Ukrainian regime started collapsing. And actually, junta collapsed half a year after the first student protests in Athens in November 1973, and the colonels were tried a year later. Well, in Ukraine it happened a bit sooner. Hopefully, the leaders of the junta will be tried also sooner. Both the Greek junta and the government of Yanukovych declared themselves close to the church, and this is another interesting similarity. And they also declared themselves protecting the interests of the church. Both, however, violated the basic rules of the church. Thus, for instance, the junta forced the resignation of an old and ill Archbishop of Athens, Chrysostomus II. French Revolution, Yanukovych relied on the support of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in unity with the Moscow Patriarchate. The church then actively participated in his campaign. When he won the presidential elections in 2009, he declaratively supported the Ukrainian Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. In 2012, however, when the unofficial campaign for his re-election in 2015 started, he began intervening in the affairs of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, apparently with the purpose to secure its support in 2015. His pressure was not very visible, but it was very fierce. From April 2012, Yanukovych decided to replace the primate of this church, Metropolitan Volodymyr Sabodan, with his own candidate. Actually, I was kind of participant of the discussions of this kind. There was, I can say it now openly, it happened for me to be in Kyiv at the time. And some people from the Metropolia called me and invited me to participate in a meeting where there were people from the administration of the president, people from SBU, people from the government, a few of them. And the topic of the discussion was how to remove Metropolitan Volodymyr from his place. And it happened in April 2012. And the task of Yanukovych was that he wanted a new metropolitan by 9th of May 2012, very soon. And the discussion was how to make this as soon as possible happening. Then I started to explain to those people, look, if you remove now Metropolitan Volodymyr, and you expect that the new primate of the church will help you to win the elections in 2015, then you just damage your own cause, because the popular metropolitan will be removed. The blame will go to Yanukovych, and the majority of those who you want to support you will be against you. So it's safer for you just to keep things as they are, to keep Metropolitan Volodymyr in his place, and, well, don't intervene. Well, they were quite reasonable people. We decided that probably it's not a good time to proceed, to remove Metropolitan Volodymyr, and they prefigured a different configuration of church power, church leadership at the time, but that Yanukovych was absolutely resolved to change the leadership, regardless of what canons say, regardless of what the interests of the church are. It's a matter of fact, I can just testify this. And this is exactly a similar situation to what happened in Greece with the Black Colonels. The Black Colonels explored the ultimately conservative agenda. They closed down the nightclubs. They urged everyone women to wear long skirts and so forth. They pretended to be a kind of conservative, protecting power, and in effect, they damaged the church a lot. This is the case when the ideological preoccupation of the regime, which is supposed to protect some kind of conservative, ideologically charged values, attacks the institution which actually supports this, supposed to support this kind of values. This is a kind of paradox, how ideology works against the church, even if this ideology seems to be kind of church friendly. Yanukovych demonstrated hostility towards the other Ukrainian churches as well, particularly to the Greek Catholic Church. The government of Yanukovych started pressuring the Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv as early as in May 2010. This pressure reached its peak in January 2014, when the Ministry of Culture brought to the primate of the church, Archbishop Yaroslav Shevchuk, a letter warning him that this church could be deprived of the state registration. All the Ukrainian churches thus became victims of the regime of Yanukovych. All of them had reasons to condemn this regime. Not all of them, however, did this. During the 3 months of the protests, the Ukrainian churches matured in their stand vis-à-vis the social and moral issues that the Maidan attempted to resolve. They appreciated the non-violent character of the protests and enhanced this character of the Maidan. They gradually supported the moral agenda of the protesters and gave them theological legitimacy. They also re-evaluated their relationship with the state. In the triangle church-state society, as I mentioned, they chose to align with the latter, with the society. Although this reorientation has happened in the history of the Eastern churches, it is not common for them. The realignment of the Ukrainian churches with the society at the expense of the relationship with the political regime enhanced an alternative pattern of the relations of the Eastern churches with the state. This pattern became inclusive of the society. Moreover, the Ukrainian case demonstrates that the Eastern churches can go further than just supporting the interests of the people. In the past, this is an important feature, I'd like to stress it, this sort of support of the church towards the society took a shape of nationalism. Nationalism was a form of alignment of the church with the people, essentially. Now, the church, in aligning with the people, took a different form by not supporting the national or nationalist agenda, but by supporting the civil agenda. And this is a very important difference, shift that we witnessed in the Maidan. The church, from being a national church, which is a common phenomenon in the Orthodox world, showed some hint that it could be more than just a national church, but that its alignment with the society could take a different form, a form of alignment with the civil agenda, with the civil society. There are many ways how the Orthodox churches can facilitate the growth of the civil society in the countries affected by the totalitarianism and that suffer from the post-totalitarian syndromes. These syndromes, however, cannot be healed without a deep de-Semitization of these societies. Civil society in the countries like Ukraine can become mature only if the majority of the people get rid of the Soviet-style paternalism, assume a full responsibility for their future, value freedom, and learn to use it responsibly. On January the 3rd this year, The Guardian published a letter, "Support the Ukrainians and they can help us build a fairer Europe," which was signed by the leading world intellectuals. They wrote that today, I quote, "Today, the Ukrainian Maidan represents Europe at its best. What many thinkers in the past and present assumed to be fundamental European values." And these intellectuals suggested that Ukraine needs a European Marshall-like plan that would ensure its transformation into a full democracy and society with guaranteed civil rights. I just want to remind that the original Marshall Plan for the after-war Europe presupposed condemnation of the ideologies that led to fascism and Nazism. Something similar is needed in Ukraine. Ukraine, after having received its independence, did not get rid of its communist past as radically as, for instance, Baltic and Central European countries did. This past still haunts the country. The regime of the Party of Regions is in coalition with its ally, the Communist Party, led the Soviet element of the Ukrainian society ad absurdum, giving thus the society a chance to eradicate these elements altogether. The role of the Ukrainian churches in eradication of the Sovietisms in the society can be similar to the role of the churches in the post-war Germany, where society was also deeply traumatized by Nazism. A German researcher, Heike Springhart, in her book Aufbrücke zu neuen Ufern, has described how the post-war German society was re-educated with the assistance of the Christian churches. This example is relevant to the situation in Ukraine. Although the German churches, in their majority, collaborated with NSDAP, the Hitler's party, and were themselves affected by the Nazi ideology, they were the only social institution with the potentiality to heal the wounds caused by Nazism. They were those relatively clear areas of the wounded German soul that could be expanded to the entire society. This followed a technique suggested by the American psychiatrist Richard Brickner, who, just in the middle of the war, wrote a powerful and influential research about technique of healing, mental diseases. His method was that he chose a relatively healthy area of a damaged brain and extended this area to the entire mind. The German churches were chosen as such healthy areas to be extrapolated to the entire German psyche. So it was a kind of psychiatric method which was applied to the entire nation. And the churches which were themselves affected by the diseases of Nazism were nevertheless enhanced and supported in order to spread their positive influence upon the entire mind of the Germans. So the church, because of its divine component, can overcome its own historical shortcomings and thus push the society to recovery. This capacity of the churches to overcome their historical limitations was discovered in the works of the German theologians like Johann Baptist Metz, Jürgen Moltmann, and others. They developed a political theology that was based on the eschatological dimension of the church, which thus became a point of exodus of the German society from the vicious circle of Nazism. The churches can do something similar in Ukraine. Even though the Ukrainian churches have been affected by the Soviet totalitarianism and the post-Soviet neo-totalitarianism, which has become particularly embodied in the regime of Yanukovych, they can serve as clear areas to provide healing to the Ukrainian psyche. For this, they need to tune up their social and political behavior in accordance with their own nature and mission. Another historical precedent on which the Ukrainian churches can build their work in Ukraine is South Africa, with its experience of overcoming apartheid. The system of segregation between the two parts of the South African society was established with the assistance of the churches, particularly the NGK, the Netherlands Reformed Church. And the churches at the same time also helped to demolish apartheid. This happened mostly under the umbrella of the South African Council of Churches, with a particular input from Archbishop Desmond Tutu. The role of the SACC was twofold: to preserve the integrity of the divided society on the one hand, and to encourage advances in demolishing apartheid. The churches did this on the basis of the traditional African concept of Ubuntu, which was creatively adapted to the Christian theology. This concept is wide and can be interpreted simultaneously as reconciliation and as a value of the human dignity. These features of Ubuntu are exactly what we need now in Ukraine, especially when we have a deeply divided society, with a huge divide between the east of Ukraine, which develops its own narrative, which is opposite to the narrative of the Maidan, and how to combine, how to put these narratives together is a major challenge which the society has to face, and which it has to face with the assistance of the churches. And the churches can harvest from the experience of other divided societies, for instance, the South African society. Not that far. To conclude and to sum up briefly, I should say that the Maidan has created a new national narrative, which will form the identity of the future generations of the Ukrainians. It consists of many stories of heroism, altruism, and sacrifice. This narrative will strengthen not only the national identity of the Ukrainian people, but also its civil priorities. The traditional national narrative of Ukraine existed before and was based mostly on the events of the 16th, 17th century, Cossacks and Zaporizhzhia Sich and so forth. Those events, Zaporizhzhia Sich, Cossacks, were idealized in a romantic way in the 19th century by the poets like Taras Shevchenko and others. And this narrative was used for building the modern Ukrainian nation. Now, the Maidan has provided a new narrative, a new basis for building the identity of the Ukrainian nation. And this is a new national narrative which includes elements of the civil society. And so so to say, democratic agenda, civil agenda has become an important part of this narrative. Also, the church has become an important part of this narrative. The input of the churches, however reluctant the churches were during the Maidan, will be an essential part of this new national narrative of the Ukrainian people, and this will be never forgotten. But we need to go further. And now that at the present situation, we need to find the way of reconciliation of the divided people. We need to find a way between two points which should be avoided, which have been described in a book by Desmond Tutu, where he said that we need to find a middle way between a tribunal and between the historical amnesty. So this is the task for the churches nowadays. Thank you for your attention.
I can't imagine that any of you have anything to say as a result of this. Who would like to engage Father first? Please.
You mentioned the churches, and I think you were in some ways quite kind, particularly to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, by leaving it out of this discussion. I mean, I would assume that in many ways, the lesson of the Maidan for that church is probably that its existence will be rather short in the future, that is, rather than strengthening it from the way the hierarchy may But what I'm more interested in is your amplification of the Ukrainian Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, and where you think they stand. Unlike the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and the Ukrainian Kyiv Patriarchate, we have fairly clear narratives when they come on side and whatever. We have quite a different story for the Moscow Patriarchate. And then the essence of church in this. That is, this church which is, as you said, in communion, and it's a little difficult to say exactly what this relation is with the Moscow Patriarchate and the Russian Orthodox Church, but now comes up with a new story after the Maidan of where the church stands on it, and the question of whether that church can maintain any unity, or above all, can have a unified narrative in it.
Yeah. Thank you for this question. It is really important. What regards the Autocephalous Church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Autocephalous Church, which is an outspring of the church here, on the eve of independence of Ukraine, and for some period of time after the independence, the church had a very clear profile of being anti-Soviet, of being intellectual, of being attractive to the intellectuals, especially those intellectuals who were, nationally concerned. And the church actually embraced those people. And it had a very, as I said, distinct social profile within the Ukrainian society. It was a church with a voice. It was a church with the position, and it has lost it all. It has lost its its standing, its profile nowadays, and that's why its voice was almost unheard during the events of the Maidan. I don't want to explore now why did this happen. I just want to say that it happened, unfortunately. Speaking of the church of the Moscow Patriarchate Church, its voice was and still is quite weak in judging, in making statements, but its power at this stage of the divided country, of the essentially, effectively, civil war in Ukraine, or just a war, because this war was inspired by the external aggression. Its position is crucially important because the Ukrainian Church, in unity with the Moscow Patriarchate, has outreach to all the parts of Ukraine, including Crimea. In Crimea, it is probably the only Ukrainian institution which survived there. There are no Ukrainian institutions, any other Ukrainian institutions in Crimea except the church. Of course, you say that at any moment the Ukrainian dioceses in Crimea may go under the direct control of Moscow. That may happen at any moment, but so far they are still there, and they are still under the auspice of the Ukrainian Church. So the Ukrainian Church has this potentiality because it has an outreach to the people in Donbass, say in Luhansk, in Kharkiv, and so forth. And that church is heard there. It is taken into consideration by the people there. And the question is, if the Ukrainian Church or the Moscow Patriarchate will be able to realize this potentiality of bridging different parts of Ukraine into the real processes of reconciliation, or it will remain just a potentiality. And I think it is important nowadays to pay attention to that.
You want to push back on that about that?
But even more specifically, from the times of Maidan, we have the Kyiv position and the burning of the documents, which was very interesting.
Yes.
It was, if not a voice, the smoke told something was going on. And I understand we have the departure of the Metropolitan of Odessa to Crimea, possibly. We assume that he may have left.
Yeah.
But apart from the varied traditions of that church, can you call it a church when it is part of the Moscow Patriarchate, and when from that patriarch a very different voice is being heard about the situation in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And how can that church within Ukraine form a policy and still remain part of the Russian church, which has a very different policy?
You know, Maidan has hosted a very difficult, hard process of emancipation of the Ukrainian church from Moscow. The church was forced to emancipate it further. This process started much earlier, and milestone of this process was, say, in 2004 and 2007, when the church condemned the so-called political orthodoxy, which was exactly an ideological hand of Moscow within the church. The church just cut this hand. It was hard. The church had to pay for that. I was moved from Kyiv to Moscow, for instance. But the process has continued. And I think the Maidan has enhanced these processes. The church now faces a very difficult dilemma: to be fully associated with Moscow and to be a church of the aggression, which supports the aggression, say, or to develop its own position within the society, which has alienated itself dramatically from Moscow, and which is suffering from the aggression from Russia. I cannot say how far the church will go in this process of emancipation. No one can say this, but I can only say that the church is facing very hard choices, very difficult decisions to make. And of course, within the church there are people who are politically absolutely in favor of Moscow. Metropolitan Garfunkel, of course, is one of them. The person who actually greatly contributed to my removal personally. But I don't have anything personal against him. I just say that even Metropolitan Garfunkel is he is representative in many regards of what Ukraine is. Yes, Ukraine is different. I mean, people like Metropolitan Garfunkel is also a part of Ukraine that we need to somehow to reconcile. Maybe an extreme, he is an extremal kind of manifestation of a part of the Ukrainian society, but it is there, and we just cannot ignore them or condemn them or say that they don't belong to us. No, the problem for us, they do belong to us. They are the same citizens of Ukraine, and there are lots of them. And how we face this, how we take this, this is a very difficult thing. I think no other church, like the Patriarchate of Kyiv or the Greek Catholic Church, faces the same kind of problem, because their flocks are more or less homogeneous, politically and socially. Our flocks, the flocks of the Ukrainian Church in unity with the Moscow Patriarchate, is as diverse as Ukraine is. And if we want to keep Ukraine one state, we should accept its diversity. And the Church of the Moscow Patriarchate is one of the institutions that can keep the state, that keep the parts of the Ukrainian state together.
Thank you. Please.
Vladimir Kravchenko, Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. I have two questions actually, and both of them are provocative to some degree. Can you see any difference? Can you see any difference between your interpretation of the Maidan phenomena and the official attitude of the Russian Orthodox Church? This is the first question. And another one: if you consider Ukrainian state, Ukrainian church, and Ukrainian society to be less real than the Maidan, don't you think it reveals sort of sacralization of the phenomena?
Yeah.
Thank you.
it's a good point. First, I don't know about the interpretation of the Maidan, which would be projected somehow by the Moscow Patriarchate. Now, there are a few statements, rather not saying many things. They have been produced in order, to have a statement at least, to say something. Means to say something without saying really many things. Definitely, it's my interpretation, of course. I try to give some kind of, create some kind of narrative about Maidan, which maybe sacralizes Maidan somehow. Though I've fully realized the shortcomings of the Maidan. I fully realize that Maidan, as any social phenomenon, has its positive and negative sides, and you cannot describe Maidan in a few words or even in one lecture. There are as many Maidans as many people who participated in it. But I think, things, someone said that I believe only those things which one can prove with his or her blood. Maidan is real because people were ready to die for it. People were not ready to die for other things, for, for the president or for the opposition leaders, no. But Maidan is real, more real than the opposition or the state in Ukraine, as far as more people were ready to die for the Maidan and for the values of Maidan than they were ready to die for other things in Ukraine.
Thank you.
Is that satisfying? Natalia.
Natalia, from the field of modern languages and cultural studies, I want to begin by thanking you for framing your introduction within an eschatological and apocalyptic framework, right? I have two questions. The first one is theological. The second one is historical, or one historical interpretation. The theological one concerns the theology of courage. Let me give you a little background. In the 18th century, under Mazeppa, the Kyiv Theological Academy imports a Jesuit play devoted to Catherine of Alexandria. This is in preparation for the Puhala War, where it promotes the idea of self-sacrifice and shedding your own blood to defend freedom. Okay, this is very clearly documented in the review that created that particular play. What I found interesting when I was following the preaching of many of the priests and the mufti and the rabbi was the concept of courage. So I'm interested whether there has been an ecumenical attempt among the various denominations. So I'm asking you to go beyond the Orthodox or the Greek Catholic, which are basically branches of the same church, to talk about whether there has been an attempt to formulate a theology of courage among the various denominations in order to help toward the creation of civil society. Now, the second point is historical. And forgive me, but I will not call this gentleman patriarch. I will call him Mr. Hundayev, Kirill. I apologize, but I cannot call him a patriarch. He has basically proposed a historical vision, a kind of anachronistic vision of the Triune Rus, which would allow Putin to amalgamate all these former territories into one new empire. Has there been a reaction among the clergy of the Orthodox churches to this? And I'm talking about the historians. I'm assuming that there are historical scholars among the clergy to discuss this issue. Do they accept it? Do they reject it? Do they criticize it openly?
Yeah, thank you for the questions. First question. Well, I believe that Maidan has become an ecumenical event because people of different confessions and even faiths, they stood next to each other in the Maidan. and no other means, like no other dialogue or whatever, brought the churches closer to each other than the events of the Maidan. And I think that if we speak about the methodologies or strategies of rapprochement between the churches, the most effective way for the churches to get closer to each other is to address their energy, to put their energy, invest their energy into achieving common causes. Not just talking to each other, in the dialogue, but doing something together. And Maidan was such a cause, such an important cause that brought the churches together. In this regard, yes, they worked together, they got much closer to each other. And of course, the theology of courage, I didn't think about this actually. I think, yes, the churches still need to reflect on this. I haven't heard of any reflection so far on this, but that's a good point. Maybe a task for the future, close future, next future. Concerning the second question, well, to my understanding, as I can conclude from the conversations with many clergy in Russia and Ukraine, there is a good deal of criticism of the ideological concepts promoted by the propaganda, and say there is a good deal of criticism concerning the concept of the Russian world. I personally, well, openly and clearly stated, for instance, when I was still in Moscow, and I had a chance to deliver my opinion to the leadership there, and I said that it is completely unhistorical and it is completely devastating to the church to adopt this kind of doctrine. And I know that many bishops, even in the Russian church, in Moscow, not just Ukrainian church, are against this doctrine, but they cannot, and they don't want, well, they both don't want and cannot speak out loudly against it. I also know that the Ukrainian bishops of the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine are even more critical about this doctrine. And some of them, they spoke against it openly, like Metropolitan Sophronia, Plutocracy, for instance. So, well, that's my response.
You want to pursue it any further?
No, I just wanted to say that I truly admired all the priests on the Maidan, and I was especially pleased to see the Moscow Patriarchate priests working so well with everyone else, and I think that I would love to see a book dedicated to the cooperation among all the clergy, including the non-Christian communities.
I think we envisage such a book.
Great.
You mentioned that Metropolitan Leiden is a very popular figure. Do you not envision that his death might not serve as a catalyst for bringing some of these issues to a head in the Moscow Patriarchal Church?
Well, I don't like to speculate on his death. Which I think it is. Many people have done such kind of speculations, and proved to be wrong. I just don't like the idea. But I think, of course, there will be changes. And I think what is important is not to lose this momentum that the church has received from the Maidan. And the quality of the changes will depend on this connectedness of the churches with the Maidan that emerged, that we witnessed during the Maidan days. We shouldn't forget that the Maidan was not just, a protest against the regime of Yanukovych, and after Yanukovych was gone, we should just, write down Maidan to the history, say it's a part of the history. No, Maidan was exactly about the things which are still extremely important for Ukraine, like justice, like social responsibility of the politicians and of the citizens. Maidan was, as I mentioned in my paper, was a very particular perception, interpretation of what it means to be a citizen. And I think the churches also should not forget about this. And an important part of this perception of the citizenship is exactly an ability of the citizens to use their freedom with responsibility, without lending this freedom to someone else, without giving up this freedom. It is very hard to be citizens with this idea of freedom, but I think the churches should encourage the people. The churches should explain to people why freedom is important, because it is a divine gift. It is something which is given to us by God, and therefore we need to use it with responsibility, and we need to value it.
And not give it away.
And not give it away, because to give away the freedom is a sin. To be a paternalistic society is a social sin for the society. So we can explain these things in theological terms.
This is a huge issue in many, many countries with large Muslim populations these days as well. It's interesting to me to see the way in which that plays on both sides. Please.
Having heard you, you appear to be a dissident. And I certainly hope that you aren't treated the same way as Gleb Yakunin was treated by the Moscow Church. But you have, Ukraine has reached the point, and the Moscow Patriarchate Church in Ukraine is also at that point where it needs to decide whether to follow the traditional two-headed eagle approach of the Patriarch and Putin as part of one entity, and a division between church and state, which is what exists in most democratic societies. Recently we saw Metropolitan Hilarion, I think he's the column minister of propaganda for the Moscow Church, was denied admission into Dnipropetrovsk. Can you tell us something about that? What happened there? Was this a decision just of the government, or was this a decision of church people in Ukraine that rebelled against Kirill sending his emissary into Ukraine at a very delicate time? And does this sort of predict a greater independence for the Moscow Patriarchate Church in Ukraine from Moscow?
Well, first I think that Metropolitan Hilarion is not a minister of propaganda, he is a kind of minister of foreign affairs of the church. Well, I know him personally. I can say that he's probably one of those few people in the Russian church who are very far from propaganda. Well, you may disagree with this, but that's my personal experience. I cannot interpret actually what happened exactly, because I only can read news that you read, and we don't learn much from the news. I think what was the real reason and what really happened. Well, so I cannot really add to what news said. Well, it is. I think it's an indication of the tensions, and an indication of the thing that I've explained that I made the kind of central point of my presentation, is that the church is a very important part of the developments of Ukraine nowadays, for both sides, from the side of Ukraine and from the side of Russia. And it's not a situation of the that existed in 20 or 30 years ago when the church was just was expelled from the public square, and the church has to pay for its presence in the public square. When the church insists that it wants to be a part of the public square, it needs to pay for that, and that is the price.
But what you see here, if I can just come back to your first point, is that you're really seeing a moment when the double-headed eagle isn't going to look quite the same as it did before. Or you're suggesting that here we see a moment where the church is engaging with the society and not simply with the state.
Yeah.
And in some cases, maybe not with the state at all. But it's a dynamic moment.
Exactly.
It's a very dynamic moment in which that is going to be sorted out one way or the other. And you, of course, have laid your chips down on one side of that.
Yeah. Yes, it is tempting to say that in Russia, the church has aligned firmly with the state. In Ukraine, it is aligning with the society. I think it's an oversimplification because the rhetoric of the church in Russia is that we are with the majority of the Russian people. The majority of the Russian people say they want war with Ukraine. The majority of the Russian people support Putin.
88%.
Huh?
88%.
Exactly.
Yes, true.
Exactly. These are people, not just the state. And you face a very difficult situation when the church now goes along with the majority of the Russian people. And how to interpret, how to evaluate this. Yes, we disagree as Ukrainians with this. We can explain this with the induction of the Russian propaganda. Okay? But again, the Russian propaganda works only by amplifying the popular moods, not by just creating them. There are already moods, pro-war, pro-military moods, anti-Ukrainian moods in the society. The propaganda enhances them, and the church may align with them because the majority of the society support them. How do you face this situation? So the church, essentially, the dilemma of the church in Russia is, well, to stand against Putin, say, but also to stand against the majority attitude. It's very complicated. It's not that simple that, the church just chooses the state. No, it's not a double-headed eagle. It's more complicated.
But in the liturgy, it's blessed are the peacemakers.
Yes, exactly.
There's an inner challenge that is
exactly, and
always
that's why it is also it's an indication that for the church it is dangerous to just to follow the popular moods. I mean, even in Ukraine, fortunately, I believe that the Maidan embodied many of the Christian values. Fortunately so. But if we imagine that the majority of the Ukrainians would come to the Maidan for the cause which would be contrary to the gospel, the church had to oppose this. So the church has actually to hear, to listen to the gospel, to be faithful to its own mission, and not just to be, caught and following in a populist kind of way what the majority of the people want.
But isn't the choice between Christianity, and you can't argue that Putinism is Christian.
No,
He
of course.
he is the antithesis of Christianity. And so if the church in Russia supports Putin and encourages the Russian people to support Putin, are they being Christian? or should they not behave like the early Christians did and say, we will fight for Christianity and the teachings of Christ, rather than submit to the state?
They said they'd die rather than submit. That's a little different than fighting.
Yes, the church has to raise her voice, definitely, in any circumstance. And I believe there are voices.
Mhm.
There are many voices, even in Russia, but there are voices, even within the church. So I think we just need to raise more concerns about what is going on there, and to speak more loudly.
Very interesting discussion. Thank you very much, Father. Particularly in terms of, we're all talking about symbolic images, double-headed eagle statues of Lenin and Maidan. And when you talked about Maidan, something really struck me as to the depth that what it meant seems to have sunk into certain elements, say, in Donetsk and Luhansk. Because I remember one of the obscure posts I did on Facebook that come from Ukraine. One of the demands of people either in Donetsk or Luhansk for ceasing activity was to take apart the remains of Maidan. That is, clear the square, etc., and then maybe there would be grounds for talk. And it just struck me, inasmuch as we talked about the statues of Lenin, which is sacrilegious to the Sovietized mind, that the image of the Maidan and what it really stood for somehow has indeed sunk in to the psyche of some of the people who are running the show and pretending to represent the people of the eastern provinces. Because of that seemingly silly demand, when I read it, I thought this is nonsense. This is
Yeah.
And now I realize perhaps they are really onto something. They really understand what Maidan is about, and they want the destruction, the physical destruction of the remains of Maidan as a removal of it from historical memory.
I would completely agree with you, definitely. And I think that the image of the hundreds of thousands of people coming together and just, speaking up and delivering their voice, their concerns, is a kind of the most scariest nightmare of many people, at least of one person in Moscow. And it functions irrationally. I mean, this image functions irrationally. Because, rationally, there are many gatherings and people may come to different things and causes and what is bad and dangerous. But I think Maidan, yes, it functions as an image irrationally, and it scares me.
I'd like to throw a comedic example. We were talking about the difference, the painful difference that the Russian church faces vis-a-vis its own populace and where they're going. Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky faced the same problem with unfortunate results. He issued things like his pastoral letters in Ubi and his condemnation of right-wing Ukrainian politics, and it seems not to have sunk into the masses, because the masses were not interested in so much that approach to reality. And it was the same problem. Sheptytsky was on one side, and certain other elements of particularly Western Ukrainian society said yes, and didn't listen, particularly to the encyclical pastoral letter Ne'ubi. So it is a dilemma, and I can recognize that it's a painful one. which we have to live with to the present day.
David, and I think we're going to have to wind things up after this.
Sort of a quick comment and a question. The comment is you talk a lot about the sort of regime organic comment and they focus on getting rich. And leaving aside the situation in eastern Ukraine for a moment, in about 10 days' time we have an election of president of Ukraine. The two main candidates are basically oligarchs. Extremely rich, in fact the leading candidate, one of the founders of Yanukovych's party. So after all these demonstrations, all these sacrifices in the square, what essentially has changed? And I wondered what the Church's attitude is to the oligarchs who basically dominate Ukrainian economic life today.
Well, I don't think I can answer this question first. Why those people are on top of the list? I think the choice could be rich, definitely. The society is tempted to slip to the same problem that it tried to overcome on the Maidan, and particularly the problem of paternalism. Just of some candidates, they contain exactly this temptation of paternalism. I will give you everything, just I think this is dangerous. This is something that damaged the civil protest, the origin. And as one of the journalists rightly says that the ultimate task of the Ukrainian society is to reconstruct the oligarchic model of the state in Ukraine. It's very important state, and the question is who of the candidates can do this. Definitely the churches are benefiting from this model. And the churches, when the churches will support, people imagine that the churches support an alternative, non-oligarchic, more just and egalitarian model, democratic model of the state. Maybe the churches will not receive the same commissions from, model. That's why, yes, it is kind of chaotic, self-emptying effort that the church is required to demonstrate that they really want the society, the people, to be just with more justice, more truth, even though the churches have that. So it's a task, and well, the churches are supposed to interact in this way. I'm not sure that they will be able. Actually, all of them, not just the Moscow Catholic.
It's an old challenge for the church, whether you really are following the King of Liberty or the bread king. It's an old problem. Thanks so much. Good to see all of you. And this evening at 7 o'clock at St. John's Cathedral's Cultural Center, we will continue this, and you're welcome to come, and I hope we will be able to entertain more of your considerations until 4 in the morning. Thank you very much.
David, I think it's at the Institute, not at the Cultural
Oh, it's
Center.
at the Cultural Center.
Cultural Center? Okay.
10611 110th.
I appreciate you intervening, however, since I'm often involved.
Okay, go. Can I just ask
Shevchenko would like to see his tales